Livestream. We'll be getting started in just a moment, so it's a great time to start getting questions into the chat window for our moderators to review and copy over to me so we can jump right into the Q&A. If we don't have a chance to get to your questions today, feel free to leave them in the comments section on the video, and I'll try to get to them a while after the show, or visit any of our social media sites like Reddit and Facebook to continue the discussion with me or the other audience members. And let's get started. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our monthly live stream. We're going to get started with questions in just a moment. Please make sure to relay those into the chat window so our mods can go ahead and pick them out. I gather one of them's having a little bit of trouble logging in, so I might have to grab them straight out the screen for a bit. We did have one I noticed in the chat as we were getting started, and that was about the Dyson swarms and whether or not they'd always look the same inside a fusion economy. When you're dealing with a Dyson swarm or a Dyson sphere, you're englobing an entire star so that we would expect all the visual light, or most of the visual light, to disappear and be replaced with infrared light that was expended as waste heat. It's got to expend it as waste heat, though, as the infrared. It could be a higher frequency or a lower frequency than what we expect from Earth. But that infrared's got to come out, otherwise you cook the people inside it. They'd heat up very, very quickly. The sun is, on average, a couple million degrees or more, and the mass of it is like 500 times that of the entire solar system. So if it wasn't dispensing that in the infrared, everything would cook in short order. But the question then becomes, if you've got something like fusion power, or if you've got something like a black hole that you're using as a power source instead of stars, would you still expect that kind of Dyson dilemma effect where they'd spread out and eat up every star so you couldn't see the night sky? Or where you'd just be able to see one lone Dyson. And the thing is, if you've got that thing sitting there giving off light, you're probably going to take advantage of it because it's free power that's going to use one way or another. But you could also, by means of star lifting, go ahead and move that into your fusion reactors, lift the gas off the star and move it to your fusion reactors, or dump it into a black hole and get better power efficiency. And so the thing is, would you still see that going around stars? And you'd still expect an englobement of that star to pull the matter off it, and if you can't pull the matter off it, you'd still englobe it for the free power so it doesn't go to waste. But for those actual artificial power sources, like a fusion economy or a black hole economy, whether or not you are tightening up or spreading out, the thing is, the bigger you get, your density kind of has to fall off with the inverse power of the radius of your swarm. And so you are going to end up still with the same effect, though, because you're falling off to get yourself as close together as you can without overheating. And that was also something that's going to look like a big spherical glob anyway, and at that same frequency range. It might be bigger or smaller in terms of net power output than a star would be, but then stars vary very wildly. And if you're on the very heavy end of that, a very, very large civilization like that, that's much bigger than a single star would output, even a giant, that's going to be very hard to miss because that's a gigantic infrared blob. So basically, one way or another, you end up with that Dyson effect that we refer to, which is not so much about the Dyson swarm itself, but rather the waste heat of a very large civilization that's trying to keep itself fairly compact. Now, it's always possible they might spread out really thin, but then the question is why? When you get to about the size of a Dyson swarm, let alone bigger, and again, the more energy you've got, the more spread out you have to be to inverse with the actual power you're producing out. So if you're bigger than a star in terms of your power output, you have to be much, much bigger as your englobement. You can pack everybody in very, very tight, but you can only pack them in as tight as you can get rid of the waste heat. And you can pack them in loose too, but you're already so spread out. I mean, these things have a density of considerably less than anything we expect on Earth, that you wouldn't really see people wanting to spread out that much for the sake of privacy. Whether it's 100 kilometers between you and the next station or a million, that's a lot of empty space. And so essentially you're always going to expect to see that packing. There might be some people spread out, but not so much that the entire civilization would be, because they want that minimum signal lag, that minimum travel time, that minimum travel energy. So you would be packed together and still get the exact same effect. Okay, we have a question from Jazzman. He asks, have you ever read I have a mouth but I must scream? I think that's I have no mouth but I must scream. That's by Harlan Ellison, one of his famous short stories. And I don't remember, was that one of our books of the month or not? It's a short story, so I don't know if I'd have done it as book of the month. Yes, it's one of my favorites. Actually, Harlan Ellison's one of the few famous sci-fi writers I've actually met. Way back around 2000 or so, I saw him at the library giving a talk with my mom, who's a big sci-fi fan too. And he was supposed to be talking about Ray Bradbury's book, Fahrenheit 451, but he spent the entire time talking about other things. He had us glued to our seats for like 3 hours. That man is just was just a phenomenal talker. And he's from my area in Ohio. So, but yes, I have read that book, and I would recommend it to everybody else. The short story, I Have No Mouth, But I Must Scream. Event Horizon says, greetings from Maine. Question, do you play Kerbal Space Program by any chance? I know of it, but I don't actually play it myself. I'm always way behind on video games or simulators, and I've seen the product of it. It looks pretty awesome, but I just haven't had the time to really get into it too much myself. I know it's very popular with the audience, though. Okay, let me put up another question real quick. Brian A. Bones asks, why doesn't every animal end up evolving into a human? Well, that's actually, because there's a lot of questions to unpack in that one. When we're looking at science fiction, there's often the idea that all aliens will look humanoid, and that, of course, has nothing to do with expectation. That has to do with makeup budgets, So it's hard to put together new alien species from like Star Trek every week, so you go with very simple things that make them look clearly non-human, so they're an alien. But as to congruent evolution, the human form is a pretty impressive one for all purposes. It's very well designed to allow us to dissipate heat very quickly, and we do tend to think that's one of the reasons why we have the bigger brain in the first place. We're better at heat dissipation. We're got that capacity of sweat, for instance. We're a persistence predator, it's called. One of those types of things that can just chase after its prey a lot. But there's no real reason why anything would evolve specifically to a human form, if that's the question. If, on the other hand, the question is, why doesn't everything evolve to have the same intelligence as a human? We're the first ones on the scene, and whichever one's first on the scene kind of changes the landscape. We don't know that if we didn't wait another 1,000,000 or 10 million years, we wouldn't have had intelligent raccoons or dolphins or things like that were at the human level. But we also don't know that necessarily is the one that, that we don't know that high intelligence is something that evolution would always aim for. Most things on Earth are much more evolved than humans, as strange as that sounds, and are not intelligent. And so what do we mean by evolved? If we're assuming that each generation brings greater complexity, right? So that the most evolved thing, or greater tuning to one's environment. And again, it always depends on what do you mean by evolution having an end goal for, what's most evolved, because of course evolution doesn't have goals. I think even a moment ago I was saying we're designed, right? That's if we're assuming that random evolution towards things has no particular end goal, then you would have to say the only legitimate way to measure how evolved something is by how many generations it had since abiogenesis occurred. So what would be most evolved? Well, it wouldn't be humans. Of all the species on this planet, the one that has the least generations back, in terms of animals at least, would presumably be humans, but we have very long lifetimes and very long rates between when we breed. We take like 10 to 20 years before we even start getting in that zone. Obviously longer these days, but even fairly ancient humans tend to have pretty long growth periods too. And so we have some of the longest generations. Obviously there's certain trees or things like that last longer, whereas some bacteria that reproduces every 12 hours has, billions of generations more than us to say it's more evolved than that. So if that's the case, you can't really say that something that's had more generations to evolve is less evolved than us, and so you can't say that they would necessarily be aiming towards intelligence as a natural track. So again, there's the temptation to assume that evolution leads to intelligence and higher intelligence, but a lot of the biologists I know have said that's not very likely to be the case, and that's obviously very important for Fermi Paradox, but we really don't know yet. Let's see. Libertarian Lennis Rants asks, are you familiar with the German science fiction series Perry Rhodan? I've heard of it, but that's about it. I know some parts were translated. I'm afraid that's pretty much all I do know, is that there was a series called, a series I thought was written by Perry Rhodan, but I guess it's called Perry Rhodan. And that brings a memory, but that's about it. Thank you, Nathan Lusso. He is asking, I was wondering if you'd heard of if you had a Hall effect thruster in orbit with an exhaust velocity about the escape velocity of Earth, would the exhaust escape? It depends on which direction it was being pointed. If you've got an exhaust velocity that exceeds what the escape velocity would be while you're in orbit, which of course is lower than when you're on the planet, and it's aimed, away, then yes, it's going to escape. If on the other hand it's aimed down toward the Earth, then no, it would not. And of course, these things are usually aimed at an angle as opposed to a perfect one or not. So generally speaking, if something's running with an exhaust velocity that just has to be the same as Earth's escape velocity, it's probably not going to escape. It would usually need to be higher or pointed in the right direction. But yes, it would escape. And for that matter, a lot of it would get ionized and leave later on too, as it just got hit by sunlight and pushed away. ASDFGHKJKL. I'll get my keyboard for that one. Middle keyboard asks, what do you think would be a good way to clean debris out of Earth's orbit to clean up and prevent Kessler syndrome? We discussed that a little bit in, I believe, the Space Channels episode or in the Orbital Infrastructure episode. Kessler syndrome is a concern we have that if you have debris, or if you have things orbiting in space, if you get debris, it can go hit something else and generate more debris and cause more things to go out and get more debris and kind of chain react until you're having everything in orbit just blasted into smithereens and kind of cut you off in space travel. How will you go about cleaning that up? If you are dealing with it in orbit in little bits to prevent the cascade effect, there's a number of options available to you on the table. But if you're trying to do it ground side, probably your best way to do that was what we call a laser broom, or a laser ablative broom. What you're doing then is hitting something with a laser. You're not vaporizing it. You could vaporize the piece of debris, and you can shoot a laser up from the ground. I think we have one at White Sands that's been our prototype for that. But trying to vaporize the entire object is going to be much more difficult and much more energy intensive. What you're instead doing is vaporizing just a little bit off one side of it. You give it a little zap and it ablates the side, and some of the material goes spraying off as vapor. And of course that amounts to a rocket flame. And if you're hitting that right, it's going to fall down, right, or escape. And of course it's even nicer if you can do this from high orbit, because then you can ablate the thing from the top, as it were, so it just blows down into the planet and burns up on the way down. But the laser boom is probably your best approach. Let's see, Valley Albu asks, do you think about gambling in the future like Space Poker or Sabacc? Sabacc is from Star Wars. I don't know if it's actually in the main canon, but it's the game that Han Solo likes to play, as well with Lando Calrissian. And I know they got cards that are electronic and change what their face is for that, but future games, we did actually look at that in future sports a little bit, but that was more interested in athletic activities as opposed to like card games. There are lots of card games out there, and I would normally say yes, you'll have tons more, and that's probably the case. You know, the longer a civilization is around and the bigger it gets, the more games you'd expect it to collect. But at the same time, you know, when I was a kid, everybody knew how to play at least a couple card games, and they knew how to play chess and checkers. And that was because those were pretty much your games. And you're starting to get a lot of other games from that era that were popping up, all those board games like Life or Candyland, and a lot of those 3M games like Acquire, for instance. But you know, we have such an increasing diversity of games available to people that I'm actually wondering if cards would stay as the main game. The nice thing about cards, it was a deck you could carry it around, and so you could play it anywhere and fit into something the size of a wallet or a pocket. Now you have a smartphone that fits into your pocket, so you know, I'm not sure that cards will really stay as the mainstay game in the future. I don't think they're going to go anywhere anytime soon, but there's so many more of the game options available, and there's so much more portability that maybe there's a good chance things like cards won't go around. Let's see. Mickey asks, do you believe that humanity will terraform Venus and Mars to be Earth-like planets with oceans and stable atmospheres? Truthfully, no, I don't think we probably will. I mean, maybe we would. We can. If you've seen Springtime on Mars or other episode Winter on Venus, we talk about how you could actually do that. But the thing is, you know, you can do a Earth-like habitat so much easier on something like an O'Neill cylinder that I often tend to wonder if you'd really go to that much effort to terraform an entire planet, because it takes so long, and you have to have the entire population or group that was involved in that stay committed to that task for centuries. Even while people living there are kind of getting used to it the way it is. You know, you might take them apart for resources to build shell wards or things like that, but I wouldn't go so far as to say I'd be surprised if it happened, but I tend to think of it as the less likely scenario. That a full-blown terraforming of Venus or Mars is, and I mean full-blown between the Earth-like planets as opposed to pale-terraforming, where you know, cover Mars in domes or do cloud cities on Venus. I tend to think full-blown terraforming is less likely than not to be the eventual fate of these places. Reven609 asks, have you ever read The Planiverse by A.K. DeWidney? It's a book about two-dimensional life and technology. No, I've actually never heard of it, but I have heard of that author. A.K. DeWidney wrote one of my favorite books as a kid, 200% of Nothing. He's a mathematician or statistician from Canada, assuming he's still alive. This was a book I read in the mid to late 80s. And I would definitely say picking that book up is good. So I've not read Planiverse because I've not heard of it, but I'm tempted to now. I would definitely recommend that book, 200% of Nothing to everyone, though. Pedro Hafferman Least asks, greetings from Gießen. He's got it pronounced there for me. Where were you stationed? I was actually stationed in Gießen. Gießen, Germany, is a little bit north of Frankfurt in Germany, and right up Route 5 there. And I was stationed on the base there that's just outside the town on, I can't remember if it's on Ludwigstrasse, but Gießen's rather famous for having been the home place of Ludwig. I can't remember his first name, Johannes Ludwig, maybe, who was the general, maybe it was Liebig? Oh, I can't remember that now. Anyway, the scientist who came up with the idea of a constrained minimum, the idea that if you got a system that's dependent on many variables, whatever the one is that you're most scarce on is kind of the one that's going to control things. Gießen, I was stationed there from 2003 to 2007, minus about 14 months in Iraq, and I do love the place. I would definitely recommend it for anyone who goes and visits. I can't say there's any major tourist things of note there. It's just a very nice town, so... and I would definitely double check everything I just said about Ludwig or Liebig, since I'm sure I'm forgetting that. Maybe it was Justin Liebig. Whichever the case. If you Google up Gießen, I'm sure you'll find that the university is named for him. Thank you, Robert Friel. How would someone begin construction on an O'Neill cylinder? That's the episode we have coming up kind of is on this upcoming Thursday is Life on Board on O'Neill cylinder. And we do talk a little bit about how we go about getting the initial funding for something like that there in terms of not the first one, but how people would do it in the future if they become a major habitat kind of thing, where we're making thousands or millions of them. How would we get our funding for the first one is a very tricky question. You presumably putting that at the L4, the L5 points, and I suspect you'd either need a nation that was very devoted to it and had a ton of money like the US and was quite content to spend, the equivalent of the entire military budget for a decade putting thing up there. Or you need an international effort. But the critical thing there is that if you wanted to realistically do a full-blown O'Neill cylinder, or even with the smaller models, you would do that after you either had near-Earth asteroid mining or moon mining very firmly in place, so you could be sourcing your raw materials off of that. Because the trickiest thing about one of those is just sourcing all that mass. But I would tend to think that's like your last stage of early space deployment. You'd have other space stations that are rotating, like Kaplana, the one that Brian Versti designed that we often show here on the channel. That's much more modest, or the Gateway Space Station. That's much more modest, and I think that would be something you could conceivably build. Even then, I'd prefer an international effort, not so much because one country couldn't fund something like that. That would be pretty expensive on anybody's budget, but because that, I don't know, I tend to prefer international space efforts where possible. You get, not necessarily every country, but it gets more people with their skin in the game. And part of the problem we often have with these things is if you got a lot of technologically developed countries, or countries that are not, for that matter, that are not really actively participating in the space endeavor, they they're not going to feel as invested into as everybody else is. And of course, always nice to have the additional source of funding and personnel. Let's see. Herrera Missions asks, do you think there will be religion in the far future? Do you think that religion is part of any life forms besides us? Religion is a vague term. I mean, it's sometimes easier to say ideology. If you try to list out the characteristics of what is religion, you're going to find a bunch of other things that are usually accepted as religions that are not going to meet that trait list perfectly. So, that's kind of an impossible question to ask, to give an answer for, because the term can mean so many things. I, on the other hand, just talking about what we tend to think of as religion in the modern context, just like, let's say, the big 4 or 5 religions now, I'd be very surprised if they went anywhere in the next few millennia at least. I think that I always want to be careful talking on that subject a bit, but I can't really think of any reason why civilization would abandon those in the short term that doesn't already exist at the moment. So, as to other alien species having them, I can't think of any reason why they would not. you probably want to talk to anthropologists about why those tend to form up so much. And then, of course, you can talk to a theologian or a psychologist or a philosopher as to why we tend to have them still these days, or why they are, growing or not growing or so forth. But you have a very large and diverse society, which would you expect from one that was interplanetary, let alone interstellar. I'd be very surprised if there was any ideology that was not, or religion that was not, there somewhere, as it were. Just because you're going to have so many we only get more divorce with time, even though we've gotten much more numerous. I think we actually get divorced, as it were. And I think that's only going to be a trend that continues in the future. You need something that kind of pushes for homogeneity, to really have something like that disappear, and I'm not really seeing any real push for that in the way society would tend to look like it's going to be formed up in the future. But that's my guess, as good as anybody else's. Let's see. John Miller asks, as regards astrobiology and such, what do you think is the likelihood that life could actually exist that uses something other than carbon, giving it the additional energy that would be required? I actually just got done yesterday writing the draft script up for the non-carbon-based life episode that was the poll winner, so I'm going to punt on that question until that episode. So we'll classify that as watch and find out, WAFO. Albert Jackinson asks, if you're starting a science YouTube channel, how can you obtain credibility if you don't have a professional college or graduate degree? Any thought on that? Sorry for the odd question. I suppose it's not really an odd question. Quite a few of the folks who have science channels don't have a degree. I do, of course, in physics. But, if you know your material and you stick to what you know, Joe Scott, he covers science quite a lot and often quite well, but his degree, I think, was in marketing. He's not a science background for that, but he does his research on his topics. And he doesn't try to overgo, to areas that his, you speak to an area that you research properly, incredibly, and the same goes for me. It's why we're careful with a lot of our biology episodes, and you don't go outside that when you're discussing it, and that's the key thing there. And you make sure everybody knows if you make mistakes or that you can be wrong. Fraser Cain, Universe Today, one of our great friends, he does way more astronomy than I do. He's literally written a book on it, and yet I don't think he has a degree in physics or astronomy. Cody was an undergrad when he's got his channel started, and he knows his geology quite well. Better than me. So, it's just one of those things where don't cover topics you don't know, obviously, and that you don't have to have a degree in gardening to have a gardening channel, though. It isn't going to hurt, but as to credibility, what do people find credible? Degrees help, but a degree is just a way of telling people that other folks that know the field have said that you know it, right? That's pretty much what a degree is for. It's a voucher from other experts that says this person knows this topic. And in the absence of that, you just have to, walk the walk, as it were. If you know your field, if you know the field you're discussing, and you put proper effort into researching it, then credibility will follow as people who have been watching it say, oh yeah, he's got that right so far. If on the other hand you're putting out trash and folks are constantly making corrections to what you do, then you're not going to get credibility. So the key to credibility, of course, is to know your material so that you're credible. So, don't know if that answers the question very well, though. One thing I would say about folks starting channels, and the whole point of YouTube is to start a channel if you have something you feel like talking about. But at least that's what I usually think of as the point. And I know a lot of channels, I usually try to help out a lot of new science channels to get started, and most they get started, they do well, and then they kind of collapse because it takes a lot of time and effort to really put in there and doesn't usually grow as fast as they'd like. But then you have a lot of folks who start up a channel on any topic, doesn't really matter what it is, and they don't really invest the energy into doing it right, because what they're really trying to do, at least from what it seems like to me in many cases, is gather a following who wants to listen to what they have to say, as opposed to put out material of a specific topic that they feel people should know. I did not do that original episode on megastructurals because I was looking to gain me a big audience. I was surprised it got more than a handful of views, a handful of views. I did it because that was an interesting topic to me, and I knew some folks who might benefit from the material, and I wanted to just stop having to repeat it all the time to them and just put it in a nicer, easier format. And that's kind of grown with time. Obviously, there's nothing wrong with enjoying your work, but at the same time, if you're doing it because you just want the attention as a war, that's not going to result in a good channel. Do material, do it properly, do it with quality, and do it on something you know what you're doing about. The enemy asks, hello there, I'm currently studying material science, bionics, and photonics here in Germany, and I love it. But when do you think human scientists will become obsolete? You know, I don't like to use the term human when discussing things that are like what we say a transhuman or artificial intelligence context. I think that whether we're talking about an AI or a cyborg or any of those things, I suspect more often than not, anything that actually has a personality is going to think of itself as a human, but at the very least, it's going to think of itself as a person. It's got a personality. And so usually when we're talking about futuristic context, if we're not talking about something that's very much a baseline human, you know, one that would be alive right now, for instance, I just find it easier to say person. It avoids a lot of the confusion. You know, they might have some AI or robot or some uplifted cat or dog that does the thinking. And as to when people will be redundant, I have no idea. I wouldn't think we'd ever be obsolete. But then again, wouldn't you say someone who was born 4,000 years ago is pretty obsolete? They don't know the material from nowadays. Same basic fundamental makeup as we have. You know, it's the software more than the hardware that matters, and the hardware is probably upgradable if you want to stay relevant on that field, and you can't do it otherwise. Cthulhu Fatagan asks, question, are videos that don't win the polls forever lost to the ether? No, they are not. When it comes to like the ones we do here, because we do polls on a bunch of other places, we actually just got around to doing one on our Discord server for the first time recently. And we still haven't done one on Reddit because I'm going to figure out how to do one on Reddit. There's two places though that we go to for submissions of topics. One is over on Facebook on the poll for the Science Futurism group, and that is linked in the episode description here for the live stream. Every so often I'll run an open poll, and Facebook's poll option allows us to have people add their own option right into that poll, and people can vote on it. So I'll just pop it up there, and people will fill it out, and then I look and see what the. Usually I'll take the top one and make that an episode, and I'll take, 5 of the top runner-ups, usually the first 5, but maybe there'll be a topic I don't want to try to do, and put those over on YouTube as the 5 options for the poll there. YouTube only lets me do 5 options and doesn't let me have feedback. For Patreon, we do polls there. They let me have 25 topics there. So when we do one there, I'll have a thread, and people can't add them in, so I'll have a thread that says topic suggestions, and we'll collect all those up in that thread, and I'll put them into something that looks like a title format, and we'll run a poll on that, and we'll just run with the top one there, and maybe we'll take the top. Usually after the Patreon ones, I'm doing like the top 3 or 4, because the Patreon crowd is usually folks who have been watching the channel forever and a day, so they know what topics I've already done, and they tend to know which ones are easier for me to do, so... but when it comes to the YouTube ones here, is it dead forever if it loses the poll? No. I don't keep track of the ones, like, for instance, impact of superconductors. That one has come up as somewhere between 2nd to 5th place on a ridiculous number of polls, so we probably will end up doing an episode on that at some point. But no, it's not a dead topic if it loses the poll, but it's a question. Sometimes I'll do them just because I really want to do that episode, even if it came in like 5th place. But usually it's just put it back up on the poll, and people might change their mind and be more interested in that at a later date. But let's see. We'll take another couple questions before we head to the break. White Weasel Gaming asks, given their relatively complicated nature and the issue of needing dense energy source, will handheld laser guns always be a thing of science fiction? Probably yes. Its thing is, the laser gun's always seen as like blowing a hole through somebody, and the thing is that's very energy wasteful as a means of damaging someone. Kinetic energy, your typical bullet has a couple thousand joules of energy into it, right? A couple thousand joules. A sword or an axe thrust might have more than that. It's not as accurate. A couple thousand joules of energy would, heat up a large cup of water to boiling point. It's not exactly a couple thousand joules of energy would not even heat up a cup of water. That would be like raise a degree or 2. That's not something you're going to use to blow a hole through somebody. So you're throwing more energy at it to blow a hole through somebody. Say, why don't I just throw that into a magnetic field to accelerate a bullet up that's much bigger? You can blow a hole in a tank that way with something. And the same issue with like laser propulsion. We don't really talk about laser propulsion in a modern context too much, while we do talk about it in terms of the interstellar laser highways, for instance, because it's basically useless as propulsion. It's energy inefficient until you're at very high speeds, where you can't realistically, get that kind of exhaust velocity out of your propellant. Whereas the exhaust velocity of photons, obviously, the speed of light. I really can't see laser guns in that classic blow a hole in your fashion going out of style. But we use lasers on our guns all the time in the military. Especially, we used a lot of infrared lasers and infrared spotlights. A lot of the NPAC 2 alphas we had about. Generally, those took a little bit of time to actually calibrate to the gun, but they're very handy ones to use for night sight, for instance. So that's an example of a laser being used on a gun already. Last question before we go to break. Tangent Ovaltine asks, if you haven't done so already, I would love to see a video dedicated to the theme of turning Jupiter into a sun or red dwarf. Could we do it, and what were the consequences for Earth and Saturn's moons, Mars, and the rest of the system? Very 2000, I know, but super fun. 2001, it was actually 2010 that they did that in the sequel to 2001, Clark's book. I think we actually have discussed doing that in the Colonizing Jupiter episode, or maybe one of the other ones. It's not actually a good idea to do that, even if you could artificially compress it that way. But we might take a look at that sometime. I want to spend more time in Jupiter, because I always felt like we kind of brushed by Jupiter fairly quickly when we did that one. Maybe we could do Summer on Jupiter, follow up to, somebody make a note of that. Summer on Jupiter as a follow-up to Springtime on Mars and Winter on Venus. All right, we're going to go ahead and head to break, and we'll be back in a few minutes. While we're taking a quick break, now is an excellent time to grab a drink and a snack and get some more questions in for the second half of our show. This is our first live stream in the new year, and I want to take a moment to thank all the folks who helped make this show possible. From all the volunteers on the SFIA crew who help out on the episodes or moderating our forums, to all the donors and sponsors who help fund the show, and of course everybody watching it. SFIA relies on word of mouth, or its digital equivalent, so every time you watch a video, hit the like button, leave a comment, or share it with others, it helps us out. And since the channel has grown in subscribers every month since that first video came out in late 2014, obviously a lot of folks have been doing just that, and I want to let you know how much I appreciate that. I also want to particularly thank our script editors today, as we've been doing about 2 scripts a week of late as I prepped various Nebula exclusive and bonus episodes, and have been trying to get ahead on scripts in advance of my wedding at the end of April, and some anticipated downtime from that. We'll still have our regular weekly episodes then, but I'm getting them done early. I suspect sometimes folks assume our editors just correct my misspellings and bad grammar, and indeed that is quite the task some days, but they're generally very active in the actual material itself, either on the brainstorming or editing end, and I want to make sure credit goes where credit is due. I should also note that all our episodes do have a credit roll at the end to acknowledge all the editors, animators, and musicians whose work we use, and those are also in the credits on episode descriptions, frequently with a link next to their name to see more of their work, and I'd invite you to explore those. There is some phenomenal talent in the crew here, and I count myself very lucky that SFIA tends to attract such folks. We have a pretty busy schedule coming up, and of course you can see the upcoming schedule for February popping up in the upper right of the screen as we talk today, and that simply wouldn't be possible without all those folks helping out, and again, I can't thank them enough. If you do run into them on our forums or checking out their work on their own sites, let them know how much their help is appreciated. All that said, let's get back to the show. Okay, and we're back. Hun Rafton fan 19 asks, which place or system are you most hopeful, or would you think life is most likely to occur based on our current knowledge of astronomy? Well, in system, I would actually tend to put the odds best still for like Europa or Callisto. There's always an option that there's something, bacterial still living on Mars if anything ever lived there. Out system, obviously there's always that tendency to want to look at some of the ones from the Kepler surveys, and but there's no one I'd really say I had a big preference for that. Anything that's got a lot of planets in it that are in the habitable zone and are roughly Earth mass, I would consider to be good candidates, but nothing really sticks out in mind. We need bigger surveys, more surveys, more of actual catalogs of planets that are in the Earth mass zone. Dustin King asks, what would you do if you were the supreme dictator for life of NASA? What if you had the DoD's budget? If I had the DoD's budget, I would actually not throw that entire thing at space travel, because so much of it is, you can't always advance these things just by tossing money their way. I'd love to see more funding for it, but overfunding things sometimes just results in waste. What I would do if I had a very large budget to play with, though, would be to put, I'd say the things I'd really like to try to do first, probably play around with mass drivers here on Earth as a launch system a bit, but a small rotating space station, something considerably bigger than the ISS, but something big enough to comfortably simulate both moon and Mars gravity, and then while that's staging up, get a moon base in place, a basic one, and then start trying to work on options for doing, mining and smelting on the moon to see if we can actually start getting things like power satellites and, orbital shades and MEOs in play, and start sourcing enough material out of that to build bigger space stations. At that point, that was going well. That's when I'd start thinking about maybe doing an orbital ring. Again, orbital ring's not super advanced technology, though you need a lot of prototyping, but it's more that until you have a certain amount of throughput into space, a lot more than we have nowadays, they don't serve any purpose. I think the analogy I usually use is when you're going to Oregon for the first time, you take the Oregon Trail. You don't build a freeway or a rail line out there until there's already a lot of people living up there. So orbital rings are what you do when you start having lots more people. When you got space hotels, when you got big freighters coming in carrying material from off-world zero-G manufacturing, or gold shipments from asteroids, that sort of thing. Morv Johnson, thank you very much. Thoughts on ultra-dense deuterium Rydberg matter as nuclear fusion fuel? Possible episode on exotic reactor designs. It's got its possibilities. The thing is, deuterium fusion would be the nicest one to do, because since it does involve tritium, which is pretty rare, we could actually just fuel it locally. Same for things involving helium-3. We just don't have much helium-3 on Earth. And the ultra-dense versions are obviously, if you can keep them confined that way, you can keep your coil going, but it's still fundamentally the same problem we have at tokamak and other designs for reactors, or like the Polywell or some of the other variations. I see the fusion power episode for discussion of some of these, but it's got potential, and that's sort of a fusion. I almost feel like I'm going to jinx it by saying that's the one that's going to work. So, thank you very much, Edward Gaving. What do you think about Terrascope proposed by astronomer David Kipping? No, that was, I'm trying to remember for sure if I know what that is. I think that was the one where you wanted to turn the entire planet's connected radio telescopes into one big single telescope. And if I'm remembering that one right, then that is something I would definitely like to give a try on. We hook a lot of radio telescopes together right now to get a bigger, resolution, bigger image. But that requires a lot of coordination and timing, and trying to set them all up to do that nowadays requires more sophistication, more computerization, but that's something we're getting much, much better at. So if we can do it, and assuming that I'm remembering the Terrascope correctly as that object, then I'm definitely in favor of it. Bokov Constantine asks, Isaac, do you have plans to expand on other platforms or formats, even besides YouTube? Well, we've got our presence on Nebula Curiosity Stream. We've got ourselves on BitChain for quite some time for downloading videos. And of course, we're out on SoundCloud, iTunes, and I think I'm going to start coming out on Spotify Anchor fairly soon too, but I have to finish researching that because I just became aware that existed. Interesting thing about being a futurist is how often you find there are technologies you've never heard of, or apps or software you've never heard of. So yes, we're always trying to expand a platform to some degree, but fundamentally we host out of YouTube, and other things are mostly made to sure people have access to it. Again, like the audio only on iTunes or SoundCloud for people who prefer just to listen, or we embed them on Facebook or Reddit and things like that. So if other streaming services like YouTube pop into existence, of course we'd start going to those too. With a lot of them, though, there's always a hesitation initially. It's the same for like alternatives to Patreon. It's not just, is this system reliable and does it have enough audience so that it's actually worth taking the time to put your videos up there, which is a little bit more complicated than people would tend to assume, but is everything secure? And with a lot of new ones, one gets iffy. Like, for instance, with donations, say, we've got this new site that lets people donate to you. Say, that's great. I need to be sure that it's not storing these people's information in a way that's going to leave them open to something, If you're raising money from folks, you have a certain commitment to make sure that you're doing it safely. So we have to do a lot of double checking there. The same applies for platforms people might subscribe to. Is it ethical? Is it safe? Is it secure? And sadly, a lot of times, even if the ethics and the intent is there of a smaller platform, they just don't got the resources to really ensure that everything's running smoothly and secure. Baseball Duster asks, would you consider doing a video, in-depth video on strange stars? Stars made of strange quark matter, strange is always tempting to look at, but there's so much theory on that. I'm not sure if we would do an entire episode on that. I think we did discuss them in the Compendium of Stars very briefly, though. Engine 1213 asks, what do you think the distant future of government is? Do you think corporations would end up controlling space instead of traditional nation state? Yeah, I kind of feel like saying traditional nation states are not actually all that traditional. Like what we think of as nation states these days did not exist until 400 or 500 years ago. Maybe a little earlier if we want to count maybe early France, but This is a bit of a newer system. You go back to like, maybe with Rome, you could make a bit of an argument on that, because later Rome, it wasn't just about who lived in the city, but most of the great empires of the past were centered around a specific city-state, and everybody else who was either in their shadow or was one of their conquests. It didn't have that kind of nationalism that we see nowadays. That's a more recent phenomenon, and is constantly mutating. As to whether or not it's going to be one of those cyberpunk kind of things where the corporations take over, I don't see that. I think that's one of those examples where you always have power blocks inside any system that move to have more power. That's kind of for good or bad. It could be a very noble organization too. And so whatever those are, whatever form power takes in a given system, you would expect those to have heavy influence over the government or the culture or civilization was at the time. We say corporations, and people misuse that term all the time anyway. If you live in a village or a city in the U.S., for instance, you live in a corporation. Geneva on Lake here that I'm in, that's an incorporated municipality. Whereas the township I live in, that it's part of, is a township. It's part of the state itself. Just to the south of me, Geneva City, that's an incorporated city. Almost every large group, things like PACs, for instance, those are corporations. They have to be incorporated, and it's basically our term for any group of people that's been officially sanctioned to put together under some sort of charter, so that you have the legal power to sue them, for instance, and they can legally pay taxes or legally own property. And so in that regard, it's any government, it could be seen as a corporation already. But these things change with time and with technology and culture. So trying to guess what kind of government system we'd have in the future, I certainly would hope democracy stays popular, but you spread out to 1 million worlds around 1 million stars, and trillion habitats around those stars. Perhaps if you go Cartership 2 on all of them, you're going to have many different types of government, I would tend to think. 1,000 variations on the same basic themes. And again, you can have 100 different democracies that are mixes of other things too, and not have any that are exactly identical. We'd say, for instance, is the United States a democracy or a republic? And of course, the answer is that's like asking if an apple is red or a fruit. These are not contradictory concepts. And what else is it? Well, it's a gerontocracy, of course. Older people tend to be in charge. Can't even be president till you're 35 or in the Senate till you're 30. So it's also a gerontocracy. It's also a critarchy, ruled by judges. And these things come in many different flavors, and you see them in many different countries in different formats. So it's you have an almost infinite number of government variations you could have in play just from what we think of as the more modern versions. And I would expect to see almost every last one of those pop up. Some might go out of the way because they're not really the most efficient. On the other hand, we say we get more efficient, we get more practice in the future. On the other hand, if you're in a post-scarcity civilization, you don't necessarily care about how efficient your government is, especially things are peaceful. So you might have some very inefficient ones that were in place just for ideological reasons. Brazilius Mapper asks, Isaac, do you know what happened with the Hades 9 game? Is it still going on, or was the project canceled? Last I heard, it was still going on. I haven't talked to Nick in a few months. Video game development can go fast or slow, and they mostly just talk to me when they want some lore aspects for how the given science and technology is working. So as I'm not a computer programmer, and I know a lot of their things have to do with how they can emulate this or that. So I've not heard from them in a few months, but last I heard, everything was running strong. So I should probably check in on that. Let's see. Thank you, Ben Cheney. Hey, Isaac, new subscriber and big fan. Looking forward to hearing about life on the O'Neill cylinder this week. It should be a good episode. We actually just finished the draft video up for that yesterday, which is later than I usually have them. We have some graphics coming in, and there's sometimes delays getting those up. There's drafts, but let's see which one I'm working on right now is the video for coexistence of humans and AI. That's a bonus episode. It's up on February 9th. But it should be a fun episode, and it was a great deal of fun to put together, and with some very nice graphics that were designed just for that episode. So Lone Gunman 83, thank you very much. Would you ever do a video critiquing the Expanse as civilization, what they could be doing better? Probably not. The Expanse is one of those few exceptions I've made to actually doing an episode kind of on a show. Back when we did Surviving the Expanse of Space, it wasn't too focused on that show, but generally speaking, while I don't mind mentioning a given book or a given setting in an episode, I don't really like to make the entire episode about that. Now, there is always a temptation to do that. I thought about doing either a Sci-Fi Saturdays or Sci-Fi Sundays episode once a month that was just talking about some random show or game and focusing on that. But there are a lot of shows that do reviews. SF Debris is one of my favorites for that, and sci-fi shows, and we might dip our hands into it occasionally, but at this time, not so much. But still waiting for that season to come out, though. But we'll see how that goes. A lot of times when something changes, which group it's doing production with, the show can get better or worse. So it was a very good show, so maybe it'll get better, but fingers crossed. So it's a good show, and I would love to finish the book series, but I decided that unlike with Game of Thrones, where I read the books, I'm not going to read any of the Expanse novels past about where they're at. So in the TV show. Jude Evan asks, what do you reckon is the most profitable use of AI? Most profitable use of AI? Stock market, probably. Probably using it to analyze trends on the stock market. So, Fire Dragon 1408 asks, if there was one career that would be most impactful on positive future, what would it be? Artificial intelligence research, probably. That might be biasing for the previous question. It's we want to be kind of careful saying that human civilization keeps getting better from better science and technology, because while that is certainly true, that's not the whole effect. It's sometimes the cart leading the horse too. A lot of times our ethics and our morality improve because we have more knowledge, more prosperity to be able to sometimes to afford ethics, as it were. At the same time, though, I don't really like to encourage folks to ever think of improvements to society as being strictly limited to science and technology getting better. So a positive future, maybe a politician. I have quite a few friends who are in that field, and they buck the norm. They actually have ethics, and I'm quite fond of them. I'm engaged to one. But in terms of scientific research, I would probably say that AI research or medical research on either DNA, gene therapy, or neurology and mind augmentation would be the ones that would tend to have the most positive effect on us. Education technology, which would probably involve neurology and AI too. Those would be the ones that would probably be most important. If you can actually get people learning faster, for instance, or learning better, that has a huge impact on society. Same too for life extension. So it's kind of hard to ever nail down on one that would be most positive, but a lot of times a technology can be technology has no ethics in of itself. One technology can be turned into a horrible tool of oppression or help, depending on how you choose to use it. Thank you very much, Twilight Miss. I appreciate it very much. Mirabella Tevagard asks, what are your thoughts on the United States Space Force? It's a bit overdue. We've been talking about putting that in place since Reagan's day, possibly before, but of course that, for those who remember the Star Wars program from the 80s, and it keeps coming up, same as going back to the moon keeps coming up, and I'm glad to see one of these finally got moving. I regret very deeply that it's become a bit of a political issue, because it shouldn't be. It's been something the military's been asking for a while, or at least parts of the military have. The Air Force until the 1960s or 1950s, I can't remember which, was part of the United States Army as the U.S. Air Corps, and actually it's stationed at Fort Sill, which for all of us who were artillery went to boot camp and training at. But they wanted to be a separate command so they could focus better on doing their specific job. And we've had mostly the Air Force covering the space end of things for decades now. And it's reaching the point where, in terms of our interests, they are, seems we probably need a cybersecurity department that will be separate, virtual Space Force. It's helpful sometimes to have a separate branch. On the other hand, I do sometimes feel like it can set the ball rolling on too many subdivisions. You really have no reason to have a separate branch of the United States military until you are at least a divisional strength. And I don't mean pretendo divisional strength where you've got one general with two colonels underneath him, we have two lieutenant colonels under each of them, we have two majors under them, and you end up with some division that's got like 3,000 people instead of like 15 to 20,000 people. But generally, if you're not up to at least divisional strength, I wouldn't see a reason to have a separate command. But there was also something we said about foresight. We're only going to need to expand our interest in space. Because it gets some weird press. I don't know why people think we're going to be launching up in space with all sorts of space troopers or something like that. It has to do mostly with satellites. Everyone who was there was going to be on the ground for now. So, Richard Sleeth asks, what are your thoughts on a train to space? Excuse me. What are your thoughts on the train to space system that is being talked about? Do you have any ideas that would be a better idea for the concept? I'm afraid I'm not sure what you're referring to there. Like we have the orbital ring or the Livestream loop, which are arguably like that. Obviously, I'm a very big proponent of the orbital ring, though again, not at this time. To me, the ordering is something you build like a century down the road when you have the need for it. Same as like a freeway or a rail line. And then actually will let you take a train up to space at more. And I think we've discussed it in that episode, some of the others, but there are some interesting ways you can chain together various rings to create something that allows you to actually do direct transport, even directly to the moon on a train. You have to be very careful how you're matching things up to move those around. So, but it's always nice if you don't have to use propellant. You don't have to deal with the rocket equation then, and you can reclaim a lot of your energy when you slow things down. So that's what's nice about train-based kind of concepts for that. Vacuum trains especially can just accelerate up to really high speeds, but seriously, like with a Hyperloop, whether or not we build one of those in the next decade or so, they are something we'll probably want to build more of in the future, just because they're much more efficient. And of course, it's just a question of, is it worth the capital investment, and how long does it take to do the engineering challenges. We didn't already clear all the questions out, did we? I think we have time for a few more questions, so let me scroll down and grab a couple more. Let me scroll down. Janny Lasili asks, what is your take on the possibility that we're still having major or great filters ahead of us? This is a Fermi Paradox question. When we look at the Fermi Paradox, we have certain things that we think life would have to go through, or even before life, like planets being the habitable zone of the system, right? That would control whether or not you'd ever expect them to turn into a civilization that we could detect now. Fermi Paradox being focused on us being able to detect an alien civilization. So those mostly focus on people getting up to where we're at right now. But we couldn't actually detect ourselves if we were a couple light centuries away right now. So there are further steps ahead for anything to get to the point where we'd be able to detect it right now. And we call those the late filters. And they're presumably still ahead of us, and we start to kind of get through them. I usually only use two blanket ones, the desire and capability to get to another solar system to colonize them, and the ability to avoid blowing yourself to smithereens with your technology. AI, for instance, by the way, is usually not going to be a Fermi Paradox filter, because if Skynet takes over the planet, now you have Skynet instead of humans. It's not a Fermi Paradox solution. It still wants to go out and explore, or settle, or colonize, or resource harvest. I don't see them being, the thing about the late filters in terms of us is either something that lower the odds just a little bit, like nuclear war might kill a civilization off, or they're absolute ones. They're ones that nobody ever gets around. Like if we'd say everybody always invented an AI that killed everyone, then committed suicide. If that was something that inevitably happened, then nobody breaks through that filter, and that would be a great filter, because great filters are the ones we usually say are like lottery odds, million to one that you get through them. Whereas our minor filters, or even what we sometimes call a lesser filter on the show, things that are less likely than not to be a filter for most civilizations. That tends to be what I think of for most of the ones that would qualify as late filters, that either almost everybody gets through them, or only a pretty big fraction do at least. So I don't tend to think we have any great or major filters ahead of us, but if we do, they probably be on the great side, the things that just wipe almost everybody else out. Bullet Odshon asks, what are your thoughts on the future of food? What do you think it might be? Do you think it might ever be possible to consume pills that we full of nutrients? Yes, you could. A lot of the old science fiction, you'd have them have some kind of like high-tech pill they could chew on that tasted like an entire nice meal and kept them fully filled. And I was recently watching the original Doctor Who episodes from way back, the season 1 stuff in black and white. And in, I think, the first episode that had the Daleks in it, they offered them some food pellets. And the thing is, if you suck all the water out of something, you can reduce it to a pretty small size, like dehydrated food. But even if you're using the densest ones you can get, it's nothing but fat, protein, and carbs with no water in it. You're not going to eat a pill that's going to have all that energy in it. So you can't have hyper compact food like that if you're using, food. Now, on the other hand, if you've configured yourself to be some kind of cyborg, then you could presumably eat a pill of deuterium for your internal fusion reactor that would keep you going for a billion years or something like that. But that's not really what I call food in that context. But of course, you always have the option of just having, yes, a pill full of nutrients. It's got, 50 calories in it, and you eat 1,000 of them every week or something like that. Bob asked, question, would you consider doing an in-depth video on deep dive VR technology? Is it more likely to happen within our lifetime than life extension? I don't know. We've done the virtual worlds episode, for instance, which kind of covered the science and futurism angle of it. And I do keep thinking about actually doing a virtual reality episode. I mean, an episode that's in virtual reality as opposed to, on that topic, per se. Just because we start having the assets available to be able to do that. But I don't know if I want to go back to looking at VR in depth anymore. Because again, we're not really interested in the specific technology of what virtual reality is going to be like in 10 years from now. But we might do that. As to whether we'll have virtual reality for life extension, do we have virtual reality now? I mean, I've got a VR headset. Do we have life extension now? Well, we've got chemotherapy and all sorts of life extension technologies. All medical technologies, life extension, and we already have some VR. So, which one did we get first? I say, would you get biological immortality or full immersion VR first? And the answer is, I have no idea, but I tend to think we'll have both before the end of the 21st century. So, hard to say for sure. All right, let's do one last question and we'll call it quits for the day. If I can find one last question. Agile Hub asked, do you think that sci-fi energy weapons like plasma, laser, etc. are possible? Well, we were talking about the laser ones earlier on. Of course, you can make laser weapons. What's nice about a laser weapon in space is there's no air to spread the beam out, and it moves at the speed of light, so it's very good for hitting things. And you can punch little tiny holes in things or fly communications with it. But mostly it's the fact that it moves really fast. Plasma weapons, that's actually a little bit more possible because plasma, unlike lasers, is actually containing particles. So they have a ton of momentum behind them for their energy that they're carrying. And so in a way that's kind of like bullets are really good at what they do, but you could see plasma weapons for some things perhaps. As to a lot of the other higher tech weapons, they're very popular in some of the early sci-fi and then became very popular in a lot of the early movies and video for sci-fi because they could do that special effect really well. But I don't think they're going to be nearly as prevalent as people tend to expect that they would be. If you replace chemical weapons with something, it would probably be magnetic railguns, if you can make those portable and fast enough, but it's just hard to say. I'm sure there will be much more high-tech things in the long run, but, we've been having our best century for technological improvements in this last century, and yet most of our weapons are things that were pretty much invented in, more than a century ago, and we still use models that are very similar to it, like the Mar-Deuce, the M2 50 cal Browning that we're so fond of in the Army. That's literally the same gun it was, when the thing got invented in the first half of the 21st century. 20th century. And you make little improvements to things like the metallurgy for cooling down and things like that. So, I'll take one more there because that's an interesting question. So, do you think we could ever invent the ability to live without sleep? And of course, the answer to that is presumably yes. We don't absolutely have to have sleep, but we don't really know for sure what sleep already does. And give people a good book reference to follow up for. The idea of not falling asleep, of clearing out fatigue chemicals for fatigue poisons, does get covered in Alistair Reynolds' Revelation Space series quite a lot, and that is a book series I'm sure I've recommended many times before, but a lot of folks would probably enjoy. Sleep is important to staying alive, as we say right now, and we could probably engineer people so that it wasn't necessary, but you'd probably have to play with their fundamental brain architecture quite heavily. So then, of course, some people might answer whether or not they really want to cut that out, but you might find that the period of time needed for sleep, some people might find some way to advance that to speed it up. You would talk about subjective reality, subjective time experience. So you might have ways that you'd be able to speed up your sleep cycle, or you might do other things while you're asleep. You might have your brain, if your mind augmented, running virtual utopias or something like that while you were asleep. So, or do some learning. But it is a thought of our lives. At least I hope it's a thought of your life, because that's not something you want to cut down on. You do not enhance your productivity by sleeping 6 hours a day instead of 8. So it's a thought of our lives, and it'd be nice to be able to use it for something else, but be interesting how that ends up developing. For now, though, sleep is probably going to stay necessary until you fundamentally alter the human brain architecture. So, all right, we'll go ahead and close out from there. Thank you everybody so much for the questions, and if you have more of them, do leave them in the comments, and I'll try to get to them next day or so. So, again, thank you very much for joining us, and we will see you on Thursday. So that wraps up today's live stream Q&A. If you had a question we didn't get to or another came to mind, feel free to put that in the comments on the video, and I'll be back later this evening to answer them. You can also pop into our Facebook group, Science and Futurism with Isaac Arthur, to discuss topics with like-minded individuals, or any of our other forums. Thanks again for joining us today, and we'll see you Thursday.